right, hello everybody, and welcome to the lecture on late Chosun foreign relations. So, in this lecture, we are looking at how different states interact with each other, namely the Joseon dynasty with whatever is on the Chinese mainland, so that being the Ming dynasty and then later the Qing dynasty. Also with how they interacted with those peoples in the northeastern area. So that would be like the Jurchens or the Manchus, and then also how they interacted with what would later become known as Japan. So now that we have a foundation of how the political system and the government was organized, we're going to look at how these different states interacted with each other. So in order to do this, during the Joseon dynasty, from the middle of the from the beginning of the dynasty to about the middle of the dynasty, what we have on the Chinese mainland is the Ming dynasty. So the Ming dynasty over here, it is a huge territory compared to the Chosôn dynasty, and then we have various nomadic tribes up here in the northeastern area. And so this border right here is rather it's a high security area for the Chosôn dynasty, because this is where either the Ming dynasty, the Chinese, can gain entrance into the Chosôn, or these nomadic tribes up in the northeast can. So this is an area where we see conflict. It's an area where you have foreigners, invaders coming in, and so it's a rather dangerous place to be up here in the north. And then Korea being a peninsula and surrounded by coastline, this area was also vulnerable because we have Japanese pirates. So we're going to look at how the Joseon dynasty was able to secure itself, because as you mentioned in the previous class, that one of the responsibilities of the government is to protect its people and to defend the country against foreign invaders and foreign invasions. So as the Joseon dynasty government, it needed to then secure its borders and make sure that its people were safe inside. And again, because we have this extremely strong entity here, and then these rather aggressive tribes here, let's talk a little bit about what is up here in the northeastern region. So this area up here is rather cold in terms of climate, and there isn't a lot of arable land and not a lot of the production of food. And so depending on the weather, because this particular area is vulnerable to the weather, these tribes up here are susceptible to famine, and they thus need to go out and look for food. And so this is what lends to their nomadic tendencies. And if they are unable to get enough food up here, then they would either come over down this way or down this way into the Chosôn territory. And then we also have the archipelago of Japan over here, but because we have quite a few Japanese pirates that are taking over this region, the Joseon dynasty's coastline is vulnerable to piracy. And so we see quite a bit of piracy that occurs in the early part of the Joseon dynasty. And so basically what you need to remember is that in the beginning of the dynasty, this is a dangerous time period. And this is not a time period when we have free travel. So there are no passports, there are no visas to go on a leisure trip abroad. This is not that kind of a time period. This is a time period where the Joseon dynasty wants to be able to keep track of its people. They don't want them leaving the country, or they don't want foreigners coming in just willy-nilly, because it makes it much more difficult to control. And if you have your people who are in place and stationary, then it makes it easier for the government to know how big their population is, and how much they can tax and what they can expect in tax revenues. So again, because we have these nomadic tribes up here, overland travel into the Ming Dynasty is rather dangerous, and there is no maritime travel or trade at all because of piracy. And this is not just specific to Joseon, but we also see that the Ming Dynasty implements an isolation policy because, again, this whole area, this whole coastline right here was susceptible to piracy. And then we have these northern invaders, which is why the Ming ended up finishing the Great Wall. The Great Wall had been in construction for a very long time, but the Ming Dynasty was the dynasty that finished construction, and it was partially in order to keep invaders out. So again, this is a dangerous time period, and in the interest of domestic security, you want to keep your borders closed and control movement across these borders. All right, so one way to control this movement and to try to establish stability and peace with other countries was through the tributary system. Now, the basic logic behind the tribute system was the idea that, so China was the center of civilization, and anything outside of this, they were pretty much barbarians. For Korea, because they participated in the tribute system and were a vassal state, they were considered to have a certain level of civilization. They were not the center of civilization, but they were a civilized country. But the barbarian countries, such as the tribes up here in the northeastern region, these were called the northern barbarians. Japan, which also did not participate in the tribute system, they were considered to be the eastern barbarians. And then later on, when we talk about the western countries, such as European countries, they were considered to be Western barbarians. But anyone who participated in the tribute system, they were considered to have a certain level of civilization, and these were of varying levels depending on how much you implemented Confucian ideology. So the Joseon dynasty and Annam, or Vietnam, they did this to a large extent and were considered to be highly civilized. But there were other countries, such as down here in Thailand, who only participated in the tribute system for pragmatic reasons and did not subscribe to Confucian ideology. They were considered to be a lower level of civilization. So the framework for the tributary system is basically China as the Middle Kingdom, or the center of civilization. The ruler of the Middle Kingdom is the Chinese emperor, and he is considered to be the son of heaven. He is the ruler of all that is under heaven. So this includes basically all of the world, and China is the center of that world. And anybody who claims to be a ruler of their country, they are they take a lower status as opposed to the emperor or the son of heaven. And in order so these tributary states, these vassal states such as the Chosôn dynasty and Vietnam, in order to show recognition that they acknowledge that the emperor is the son of heaven and that the Ming dynasty is the Middle Kingdom, they pay ritual tribute and they engage in rituals. And so one form of this is the kowtow, where you have to prostrate yourself all the way to the ground. Another is by sending tribute gifts to the emperor. And so there are local products that the emperor might value. For Korea, this was something like ginseng. And then these would then be transported to the Ming capital by a tributary mission or an embassy sent from the Chosôn capital to the Ming capital and then presented to the emperor. So the ideology behind this is that the son of heaven, the emperor, is this omnipotent leader. So he is all-powerful and all-knowing, but he is also all virtuous. And this is extremely important in Confucian ideology. So he is, just as we discussed in our previous lecture, where the Korean king is supposed to be the moral example for society, well, the Chinese emperor is supposed to be the moral example for the rest of the world. And so there's this idea that because he is this moral, ethical leader, and he stands as the moral compass for the rest of civilization, that he receives the mandate of heaven. And this is what gives him the authority to be the son of heaven. And so he must follow certain universal concepts and the moral order, and he must try to maintain this moral order to the best of his ability, and this includes studying the Confucian classics and self-cultivation in order to be a virtuous leader. So this is the ideology behind this, and this is what then qualifies him to be the son of heaven. And we should also note that under this ideology, that these are universal concepts and they are universally applied. So the idea of Confucian morality is the idea that these principles, these moral principles, can be applied to all countries and should be applied to all cultures and all areas. And once they are applied, then we will have stability and harmony. So again, as we said in the previous lecture, the goal of Confucian ideology is to attain stability and harmony in society, and this is also applicable to foreign relations and to how states interact with each other. The goal is to achieve a stable and harmonious system where states can interact with each other in a peaceful way. Now, this is this affected attitudes and practices on all different levels. One of the basic fundamental principles was that if you have inside disorder and outside calamity, this spells doom and the collapse of the dynasty. So if you have like the society is not stable and there are peasant revolts and revolutions, and then you also have this coupled with foreign aggression and foreigners that are attacking, this will then mean that the dynasty is going to collapse. So in order to maintain the dynasty and to perpetuate itself, you have to ensure that not only domestically things are ordered and you have harmony and stability, but you also have to ensure that you have stability and harmony with your neighbors, with outside foreign countries. This doesn't mean, though, that this was a system where foreign countries interacted with each other on an equal basis, because there's this acknowledgement of the Ming Dynasty as the superior and the center of civilization. They are the suzerain, the suzerain power. So this is a hierarchical relationship where the Ming Dynasty takes the top position, and then you have the tributary states, which are also ordered depending on their level of civilization, and then at the bottom you have the barbarians. All right, so in a sense, this is a very inclusive ideology because you want to include civilized peoples, and by including them in this and bringing them into the system, this then lends itself to stability and harmony. And one way of including them is by the Chinese emperor bestowing titles upon foreign kings. So the Chosôn dynasty, whenever there was a new king that would come to the throne, they would report this to the Chinese emperor, and then the Chinese emperor would send a letter of investiture back to the Chosôn dynasty, acknowledging that they recognize this person as the legitimate next king, and then they would bestow a title. And but there's only one emperor in the system, and that's the Chinese emperor, sorry, the Chinese emperor. But there could be many kings. So the Vietnamese king and the Chosôn dynasty king, they were kind of viewed as like princes in the parallel European system, where you have the king and then you have princes. But again, this is a hierarchical system. All right, so let's take a look at the relationship between Chosôn and the Ming Dynasty specifically. So the Ming Dynasty lasted from 1368 to 1644, and by the time the Chosôn dynasty was established in 1392, we do have a tributary system that is in place. Now, this had been an idea and a concept that had been in formation for many hundreds of years, but because the architects of the Chosôn dynasty chose to implement Confucian ideology as its official state ideology, the Chosôn dynasty decided to actively participate in the tribute system. The Ming Dynasty is a vast empire, and it was the most powerful entity in the entire region. And to give you an idea of how powerful the Ming Dynasty was, you should recognize this as the Great Wall. The Great Wall is about 6,400 kilometers long, or 4,000 miles long. This is actually longer than the width of the United States. So this is not only a wall to try to impede the northern barbarians from coming in and attacking, but it is also a symbol of the Ming Dynasty's strength and power, because to have not only the resources, but to be able to mobilize the manpower to build such a behemoth is incredibly impressive at this time, because there were not many governments that had this kind of ability to mobilize their people and the manpower to build such a huge project and to complete such a huge project. The Forbidden City, if you have been there, this is where the emperor lived, and it is indeed a city. There are 9,999 rooms in the Forbidden City. So if you were born in the Forbidden City, and if you slept in a different room every night, by the time you were about 27 years old, you would have slept in all of the rooms. This is how large the capital, the Forbidden City is. And just also to give you an idea of how powerful the Ming Empire was. So the Ming population grew to about 500 to 600 million people. I'm sorry, grew to about 160 to 200 million people. So about 200 million people at its highest point. And the world population in 1600 was about 500 to 600 million people. So you can imagine that about 1/3 or a little more than 1/3 of the world's population was controlled by the Ming Dynasty. If the late Ming had about 200 million people in its population, to give you an equivalent, all of Europe had about 80 million. And so the Ming Empire is considered to be a real high point in Chinese civilization. All right. This is also a time where there is some limited contact with the West, because as European empires are starting to build or colonize areas in Asia, they are starting to come into contact with China, with the Ming Dynasty. And this would increase as their colonial presence in Asia increases. And then they have more and more interest in trading with the Ming and with the Qing. And later on, when the Qing Dynasty is established, we see that there's actually quite a bit of contact with the West. All right, so in terms of the Chosôn and the Ming relations, the principle of hierarchy ruled, where the Ming was the suzerain power and the Chosôn was the tributary state. So there's this idea of a superior and an inferior. And the suzerain, the Ming, had they were acknowledged as the more powerful and the pinnacle of civilization. But this was, as we saw in the previous lecture, just because this is hierarchical doesn't mean that it is just a one-way relationship. It is actually reciprocal. So the suzerain, although that they are more powerful and they are the dominant state, they still allow the vassal state, Choson dynasty to maintain its sovereignty and its authority and to go about its daily business. And also, it means that if the vassal state needs some kind of aid or help, and particularly military aid, then it is incumbent upon the suzerain power, the Ming dynasty, to send help to its vassal state. All right, so here we have a map of the late Ming dynasty. Again, this is probably about a population of 200 million, and then we have the Chosôn dynasty over here. And at this point, 1620, Japan is just starting to centralize its government. So leading up to this, it is decentralized, it's broken down into small feudal domains, and these feudal landlords, they are fighting with each other. They're called the daimyo, and they're all fighting with each other. And it isn't until Tokugawa is able to unify them that we have, in the late 16th century, a more centralized looking Japan. And then, as I said, in this northern area, we have these different nomadic tribes. So here are the Jurchens, which would later on go on to become the Manchus, and the Mongols, and these various other tribes up here. The Jurchens are a rather strong and aggressive people, and so because they are to the immediate north of the Chosôn dynasty, it is necessary for Chosôn to interact with the Jurchens to a certain extent because they want to trade with the Chosôn dynasty. They need things from the Chosôn dynasty. And also when the Chosôn dynasty is sending tributary missions over to the Ming capital, they have to pass over land and they need safe passage. Okay, so as I said, that we have this tribute system, and when tribute goods or gifts are sent to the Ming emperor, this is a ritual expression of their acceptance of Chinese suzerainty. The Chosôn dynasty must declare their loyalty to the Ming and adopt the Chinese calendar, so using Ming reign dates on all official records. And then Chinese envoys would come to Korea, come to the Chosôn dynasty with letters of investiture. And so it's during this time that Chosôn becomes what is often described as the model tribute state. So if Chosôn then has to take an inferior position, why would they participate? Well, there were many pros and cons to this system. Right, the cost is that they have to take an inferior status. It's actually quite expensive to send these missions, these tributary embassies back and forth. And the tribute goods themselves that they are sending are of high value. But the benefits really outweigh any of the costs. For one, if your direct neighbor is this very strong, powerful entity, the last thing that the Chosôn dynasty wants to do is to aggravate this powerful neighbor. You want to maintain a peaceful relationship and friendly relations with this neighbor. You don't want them intervening in your affairs. You certainly don't want them attacking you and invading you. So the best means to do this then is to participate in the tributary system, because not only is your security guaranteed, the Ming, if the Choson dynasty declares its loyalty to the Ming and participates in the tributary system, there is no reason for the Ming dynasty to attack the Choson dynasty. And in fact, it would be considered to be immoral for the Ming dynasty to attack the Choson dynasty. So your security is guaranteed. And also, if you have one of these other barbarian states that come and attack you, then the Ming dynasty must send in military aid to help you. So there's a security benefit, which is a huge one at this time. Also, your autonomy, your sovereignty is also secure, because in the tributary system, the Ming dynasty is not going to interfere in internal political affairs. The king and his officials will report on certain important events that may have occurred and send letters to the Chinese emperor, but the Chosôn state is left to govern itself. Another benefit is that because they are a tribute state and because they are regularly sending tribute missions to the Ming, this gives them unlimited access to Chinese culture and Chinese civilization. And you have to remember that as Confucianism is the main intellectual currency of the time, the Koreans want to be able to access the scholarship that is occurring in the Ming dynasty. They want to be able to exchange ideas and intellectual thoughts and books with the Ming and with Ming scholars. So this access to Chinese culture and civilization is really very valuable during the Choson dynasty. And then there's also the issue of trade. So it's really only foreign trade is allowed when these tribute missions are sent to the Ming capital, and then they are allowed, certain members of that tribute mission are allowed to trade. And so because there is no maritime trade, this is a main source of trade. So really what we see is that the benefits outweigh the costs, and it is a very pragmatic move on the part of the Chosôn dynasty because it's a way to maintain stability and to ensure that you don't have foreigners invading you from the outside, because as you recall, that's one of the main responsibilities of the government, is to protect the state sovereignty and its people. All right, let's take a look now at the foreign relations with Japan. So, as I had mentioned, piracy was a big problem at the beginning of the Chosôn dynasty. Pirates were wreaking havoc along the coastline here. So what they would do is they would attack and then steal, rape, pillage, and then they would burn things down. And so what you end up having is a lot of these villagers along this coastline were retreating into the mountains. And this was causing a huge problem for the Chosôn dynasty. It was also causing problems along this southeastern coastline for the Ming dynasty. And so both the Ming and Chosôn kept sending requests to Japan saying, hey, listen, you got to keep this piracy situation under control. But Japan, because at this point was decentralized, I mean, they couldn't even get it together internally. How are they going to get the piracy situation under control? So Japan said, yes, okay, we'll do it, but they were never able to. So finally, the Ming dynasty got sufficiently angry enough that they said to Japan, all right, forget it. You are now, we will restrict trade with you to one port here in Ningbo once every 10 years. This was a huge punishment for Japan, but this just shows the extent to which the Ming Dynasty was fed up with the piracy problem. Japan, which is, as you know, a group of islands, Japan, which also has a larger population than Korea, they have often had a problem with producing enough food to feed their population. And so Japan has had to historically look outside for trade in order to find the supplies, the basic necessities that they need. And it's also part of the reason that we see this piracy problem, is because oftentimes there are famines and starvation, and so then these pirates would go sailing across the seas in order to take what they needed. And so we see that Japan wants to trade with Korea and with China, with Chosôn and with the Ming. And then in the late 16th century, when Tokugawa, the Tokugawa military government is established, as I said, there had been these feudal lords all throughout the country in Japan, and they had been fighting with each other. And then Tokugawa comes in and they unify them, and this is not a peaceful unification. Supporters of Tokugawa, yes, they sided with him, but then they had to go in and crush any who were opposed to him. And so you have certain feudal landlords that are disgruntled and unhappy with the situation, because some of them had their lands taken away, some of them were relocated to other lands which were not as good as their former lands, and so there's a lot of discontent. And to solve this problem, the next leader in Japan, Hideyoshi, decides, you know what, we need to go to war. We need to go to war with a foreign country, because this will unify our people and unify these different landlords. So they decide to go after the Ming. But in order to do this, they need passage through Korea, through the Chosôn Dynasty. So they approach the Chosôn Dynasty and they say, hey, we're attacking the Ming. Can we come through? The Chosôn Dynasty was like, no, we don't think so. So Japan says, all right, we're going to attack you now. So this is what begins the Hideyoshi invasions. So in 1592, this is the first major invasion by Japan. In the spring of 1592, Japan sends over about 150,000 troops. And they first take Busan, and this is what this painting depicts, is the taking of Busan. And then they take Daegu, and then they take, and then they head their way up to Seoul. And this was a big loss for the Chosôn Dynasty over land. Over sea, it was a different matter. Over sea, Admiral Yi Sun-shin of the Chosôn Dynasty was able to defeat the Japanese Navy and to control the seas with his very famous turtle boats that we see here. But because over land, the Chosôn Dynasty suffered huge losses, they then appealed to the Ming Dynasty and say, hey, we need help over here. And the Ming Dynasty, they weren't really sure how serious this was. So at first, in August, they sent about 5,000 troops, and the Japanese immediately crushed these troops. So once they realized, okay, this actually is quite serious, they sent 50,000 troops, and they were able to defeat the Japanese. They take Pyongyang, they head down south, the Japanese retreat southward, peace talks are initiated, and the peace talks go back and forth for about 4 years, and then finally in 1597 they fail. And so another invasion is launched, and this fighting continues into 1598, but in 1598, in the course of battle, Hideyoshi dies. And so when he dies, these dreams of conquering the Ming also die with him. And so diplomatic relations are reestablished. And but what we see is the aftermath of these invasions is that we have widespread death and disease and destruction in the Chosôn dynasty. You can imagine as these troops are moving up and down the peninsula that this is what happens. So we have hundreds of thousands of Koreans that have died, land, houses, palaces, temples that are destroyed. An enormous population movement. And not just within Korea do we have population movement, but we also have population movement to other countries. So some Koreans married Ming troops and then traveled back to China and moved to the Ming Dynasty. Some Koreans married Japanese prisoners of war and stayed within Korea. And then there were also tens of thousands of Koreans that were taken to Japan as prisoners of war. So there's a lot of population movement in the entire region. Whether or not this led to the weakening of the Ming Dynasty, this is one of only many factors. But the late Ming Dynasty was experiencing quite a bit of problems on its own. So, for example, there were many eunuchs that had acquired quite a bit of power and were interfering in domestic politics in the Ming Dynasty. There was an increasing financial burden. So you have a series of natural disasters and famine, and also military pressure from the Mongols and the Manchus. And so the Ming Dynasty is spending a lot of money to feed their population, to fend off the Mongols and the Manchus, and they start increasing the taxes as a result of this. And when you increase the taxes, this makes the peasants very unhappy. And so now we have internal rebellions. And so, as I had stated at the beginning, internal disorder, outside aggression, what does that lead to? The fall of the dynasty. And this is precisely what happened in the mid 17th century. Is we have a turnover. So the Jurchens, which had become the Manchus up here, they consolidate all of the different tribes, and then they start putting pressure on the Ming Dynasty. And they also start putting pressure on the Chosôn Dynasty and just expanding their territory. And what we have then is the rise of the Manchus and the establishment of the Qing dynasty itself. Now, there were a couple invasions by the Manchus of the Chosôn dynasty, the first being in 1627. There were negotiations that were established, but this was quite a difficult time for the Chosôn dynasty, because it's the very end of the Ming dynasty. So the Ming dynasty still exists, and they have still proclaimed their loyalty to the Ming dynasty. But now we have the Manchus, and the Manchus are putting pressure on the Chosôn dynasty for them to sever relations with the Ming and to ally themselves with the Qing. And the Chosôn dynasty doesn't want to do that, because they They feel they have an established relationship with the Ming. The Ming helped them during the Hideyoshi invasions, but because the Manchus are rising in power and becoming incredibly powerful, they feel like they need to placate the Qing as well. And then we have Hong Taiji, who comes to power, formally establishes the Qing dynasty, demands that Korea sever its relationship with the Ming and acknowledge the Qing. And because the Chosôn dynasty does not want to do this, there's a second Manchu invasion in 1636. Shortly thereafter, in 1644, the Manchus take over the Ming dynasty. So they defeat the Ming and they establish, they take over this territory and they establish the Qing dynasty, which is even bigger and more powerful than the Ming dynasty. So here we have Chosôn over here, and here we have this monster. I mean, it's just a beast of an empire, the Qing dynasty over here. So again, the last thing that the Chosôn dynasty wants to do is to aggravate this very strong and powerful neighbor. And they need to maintain friendly relations to maintain stability and harmony. So this becomes really a conflict and a struggle for the Chosôn dynasty, because not only were they loyal to the Ming, but because the Manchus were considered to be barbarians. Remember, they are the northern barbarians. And so in terms of civilization, they are uncivilized. And the Chosôn dynasty, even though they're tiny compared to the Qing dynasty, they are far more civilized than the Manchus. So there's this struggle and this dilemma that the Chosôn dynasty has, because, you know, how can we recognize these barbarians and the leader of these barbarians as the new son of heaven? It's really very difficult for the Chosôn dynasty to do this. But in terms of pragmatism, really, what other choice do you have? And the other interesting thing is that instead of just taking over the Chosôn dynasty, which the Qing dynasty could have done because they were so powerful, they decide to let the Chosôn dynasty stay as is and to continue the tributary relationship with them. They just insert themselves in as the Ming and replace the Ming with themselves. Now, why would they do this? Well, there are actually a lot of benefits for the Qing to doing this. Not only does this continue to maintain peace and stability in the region, but in terms of Confucian ideology, because Korea is civilized, there are no moral grounds on which the Qing can take over. And also because Korea is civilized, they're not going to be any kind of threat of invasion to the Qing dynasty. So they end up being a very useful buffer state for the Qing. And especially when it comes to being a buffer state between the Qing and Japan. Because as we've seen, Japan is also this aggressive, kind of hostile country. They come from a military culture. And so it's good to have the Chosôn dynasty in between as a buffer state, and also it's a way to continue trade. And because the Qing dynasty now has taken over all of this territory here, this actually makes it somewhat safer for the Chosôn dynasty to pass from its capital to the Qing capital. All right, so now let's take a look at how relations were set up between the Chosôn dynasty and Tokugawa Japan and the Jurchens. The the principle that ruled relations was kyorin, or good relations with your neighbors. As I had said, the Japanese and the Jurchens, because they were not a part of the tributary system, they were not vassal states of the tributary system, they were considered to be barbarians. And the Chosôn dynasty, as a civilized tribute state, vassal state, they considered themselves to be more civilized. And so these relations were also hierarchical. But in this case, the Chosôn dynasty takes a higher position. So these relations, at first between Chosôn and Japan, as I said, the Japanese wanted to trade with Korea, but the Chosôn dynasty was not really into it. But after King Sejong sent in a military expedition and subdued the pirates, then good relations were established between the two countries, and trade was allowed in Busan at the Wall House, but Japanese envoys were only allowed as far as Busan and could not travel to the Chosôn capital. In contrast, when the Chosôn dynasty sent envoys to Japan, they were allowed to travel to the capital in Edo. So as you can see, these relations are uneven, unequal. And then also when we have relations with the Jurchens, so up here we have evidence of the Jurchens who would send tribute to the Chosôn capital in exchange for trade or whatever things that they wanted. Japan was not only interested in trade because they were also a Buddhist country, but were also beginning to develop their own schools of Confucianism. They were interested in the scholarship, and so they wanted books and texts from the Chosôn dynasty as well. Okay, so in this sense, the Chosôn court, they exhibited diplomatic superiority towards Japan and the Jurchens, and these relations were hierarchically ordered. So the conclusion is to this lecture that we have, during the Chosôn dynasty, tightly controlled borders. There's a limited number of foreigners entering the country, and the Chosôn dynasty is trying to keep this to a minimum. There's limited trade, and this is for the protection of domestic markets. There's virtually no contact with the West in the Chosôn dynasty. And any contact that they have with the West is generally through China, because Westerners are coming to China. And there is a long established form of foreign relations that the Chosôn dynasty is adhering to in terms of its relations with China and other countries. All right, so I will see you in the next discussion, and I hope that you are able to keep all of this information in mind as we look more in depth at how these different states interacted with each other.